Hello again, dear listener. Tonight's path begins where firelight flickers in ancient Hillforts. Before we begin, help support the channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing a small gift in return for a restful night. Snuggle in. Let your worries melt into the earth beneath mossy stones. We're heading deeper into the Celtic world. Episode 5 is about to begin. Today we're going to be talking about not just the Celtic fringe, but the fringe of the fringe, the marginal areas within the Celtic world, namely Brittany in France and Galicia in Spain. We're going to be thinking about two ways to be marginal, in fact. One kind of being marginal has to do with where the Celtic areas find themselves with respect to the major powers that came to dominate them. This kind of marginality has its roots in the classical period, when Celtic speakers were originally marginalized by the advance of Latin, which on the continent developed into Romance languages such as French and Spanish. Of course, in Britain, they were then marginalized again by the spread of the English language brought by the Anglo-Saxons. That's how the Celtic fringe came to be in the first place. It is at the edge of the areas where Latin and its successor languages, and then English, made their advance. But the Celtic fringe itself has a fringe. This kind of marginality has to do with where the different Celtic areas find themselves with respect to the Celtic world as a whole. The second kind of marginality develops much later, due to a shift in perspective that comes about in the 19th century, when an interest in Celtic heritage arose, especially in Ireland and Wales and somewhat in Scotland. These are the areas where the idea of the Celtic fringe was embraced wholeheartedly and proudly. But the result, ironically, was to create a Celtic core centered on Western Britain and Ireland. These are areas where the dominant speech that was imposed on the Celtic areas was English. So ironically, these Celtic areas all had something in common. Their various Celtic languages had been replaced by the same foreign language, English, and they were now ruled by the same foreign power, England, as the dominant part of the United Kingdom. So it was easy for the Celts of Britain and Ireland to feel a kinship with each other. They could discuss their oppression by the English in English. But what about Brittany in France and Galicia in Spain? These Celtic areas were now doubly marginal. They were marginal in the nation-states they found themselves within, France and Spain, but they were also marginal within the Celtic world. They did not speak the same mainstream language as the other Celtic enthusiasts, and in some cases, they had to work hard to get into the club of modern Celtic nations, simply to be acknowledged as part of the Celtic world. How ironic is that? So in this lecture, I will discuss Brittany and Galicia in turn. And since this is their moment to shine, I'm going to give the whole story of each region from its Celtic roots to the present. I'll spend more time on Brittany because there is a much clearer and more continuous Celtic identity there than in Galicia. In each case, I'll give a very brief account of how the area fared when it first encountered Roman power, and then how it got cut off, so to speak, from the other Celtic-speaking areas, and also a very quick overview of the relationship between that area and the larger nation-state within which it later found itself. I'll have more to say about the role that Brittany and Galicia played in the modern Celtic movement in a later lecture, but I'll give a little bit of a preview of those developments here. Let's start with the first area in our tour of the fringe, Brittany. In the Roman period, Brittany was referred to as Armorica, which means by the sea in Gaulish. That was the Celtic language spoken there at the time of Caesar. And the peninsula in western France on which Brittany is found is called the Armorican Peninsula. Brittany has been a Celtic-speaking region since as far back as our records stretch. We know this because of the many proper names that survive from the region, names for places and tribes or peoples that all have recognizable Celtic forms. But Brittany has a very long history that stretches thousands of years into the prehistoric period, probably long before the Celtic languages developed. Brittany is one of the areas on the Atlantic coast of Europe that has the largest number of megaliths. these large stone monuments that started appearing around 3,000 years BC. We see them all along the Atlantic coast and in Britain and Ireland. Stonehenge in England is the most famous of these monuments, but Brittany probably has the densest concentration of these monuments anywhere in Europe. The important thing to note about them is that they have nothing specifically to do with the Celts. They were erected long before the cultures that we associate with the Celts came into existence. But they may well have been built by the ancestors of the later Celtic-speaking inhabitants of Brittany. As we've seen, it's perfectly possible for cultures and languages to come and go while people stay right where they are. Certainly, these monuments played an important part in the thought world of the later Bretons. The megaliths probably indicate that the societies along the Atlantic seaboard were quite prosperous, probably due to extensive seaborne trade. But this prosperity seems to have ebbed in Brittany in the middle of the first millennium BC. Brittany at that time was kind of a backwater. We don't see the kinds of elaborate hill forts or rich archaeological finds in Brittany that we do in Central Europe or even Eastern France around 500 BC. You don't see princely graves like the Hallstatt period grave at Hochdorf in Germany. This is probably a sign that Brittany was not as prosperous economically. And ironically, Brittany probably suffered precisely because those eastern regions were doing well. Trade that had previously moved from east to west, from the Atlantic coast through to Central Europe, was now moving north and south from the Mediterranean up along the Rhone River. The economy seems to have picked up, though, in the centuries right before the Roman conquest, when population increased. And we can tell this because more land was being brought into cultivation. Brittany was changing politically at the same time. In the 2nd century BC, we start to see coins being minted by the three most prominent tribes in the region, the Veneti, the Ridones, and the Namnetes. And these three tribes later gave their names to the important Breton cities of Vannes, Rennes, and Nantes. Other tribes followed suit. By the 1st century BC, trading contacts and political alliances had emerged between the Armorican Peninsula and the tribes of northern Gaul on the one hand and southwestern Britain on the other. It's a fairly easy sail from southwestern Britain to Brittany. In Caesar's day, Brittany was inhabited by various Gaulish tribes, and we see within the Armorican tribes the same faction fights about policy toward Rome that we see elsewhere in Gaul. Some people thought Roman trade was going to be good for Armorica, while others feared domination by Caesar. It turns out that both parties were right. As we have seen, Caesar thoroughly conquered Gaul in the 50s BC, and Armorica was very much in the thick of the fighting. Later, Armorican soldiers were sent to help the Gaulish chieftain Vercingetorix in his last stand against Caesar. But once Vercingetorix was defeated, Armorica settled down to more than 4 centuries of fairly prosperous Roman rule. This meant a massive infrastructure investment by the Romans. A comprehensive road network was built out, in many cases based on existing trackways. But like in Britain, these roads benefited from Roman engineering. New fortresses and urban settlements were also built. Even during the height of Roman rule in Gaul, though, the area was probably still full of Gaulish speakers, even if some of them were also bilingual in Latin. Up until this point, Brittany was not particularly different from the rest of Roman-ruled Gaul. All of that changed beginning in the 5th century AD, as Roman power throughout northwestern Europe started to decline. At this time, people in southwestern Britain began to migrate to Brittany in substantial numbers from what are now Cornwall and Devon and the adjoining areas. This was a phenomenon that continued into the 6th century, and it was this migration from Britain that gave Brittany its name, and it was often referred to as Lesser Britain or Little Britain to distinguish it from the island of Britain. Now, it's relatively new to point out that we can't be sure what caused these migrations. This was, of course, a period of tremendous political and military upheaval in the Roman Empire. Parties of raiders were on the loose in northwestern Europe, especially in Britain, where the legions had been withdrawn. the economy was in dire straits as long-distance trade declined, so conditions were definitely unfavorable. But we still don't know exactly why these migrations occurred. It used to be thought that the migrants from Britain into France were fleeing Anglo-Saxon raiders. The problem is that the migrations out of Britain don't occur at exactly the same time as the Anglo-Saxon incursions. So even if fear of Anglo-Saxons was one factor in this migration, it was likely not the only one. There may have been some sort of economic push or pull that caused these people to leave, but we can't be sure. This just seems to have been a time of great fluidity. At the same time that people from Britain were settling in France, people from Ireland were settling in Britain, so it was definitely a period when elite groups in particular were looking around for ways to make the most of their economic and political opportunities. I think it's interesting to point out that sometimes scholarship makes progress in small steps, not by coming up with new answers to old questions, but simply by admitting that the old answers were wrong and admitting that we just don't know the new answers. One thing seems clear. These people who came to Brittany from southwestern Britain established dominance over the Armorican Peninsula and slowly expanded eastwards. Of course, they were speakers of the British language that they had brought with them, and the speech of the immigrants seems to have swamped whatever was being spoken there previously, which was presumably a mix of Latin and Gaulish. And again, we're not exactly sure how well the British speakers and the Gaulish speakers would have been able to communicate with each other. Possibly not all that well. As we've seen so far with the history of the Celtic languages, the fact that the British speech of the newcomers drove out the speech of the natives doesn't mean that the immigrants were very numerous, just that they brought with them enough cultural prestige to cause the existing inhabitants of the region to decide to adopt the new form of speech. And this was presumably due to the fact that the newcomers were wealthy and powerful. During this time, there was frequent contact with Britain, especially southwestern Britain, which helped preserve the linguistic links between Brittany and southwestern Britain. And in fact, Breton and Cornish are still very similar. Probably the two languages did not seriously diverge until around the year 1000 or so. And there are signs that the literary traditions of Cornwall and Brittany were closely aligned. They shared some stories, such as the story of the doomed lovers Tristan and Isolde, just the way that Wales and the Old North shared stories about the doomed raid on Cutraith by the Gododin. So, you get Breton hegemony established in the Armorican Peninsula, and thus the name of the peninsula got changed to Brittany as a result. And the Bretons continued to push east into France. But the Breton advance was finally stopped in the early 10th century by the arrival of new people coming from the east, namely the Normans, who were themselves newcomers from Scandinavia. Thereafter, the Bretons and the Normans fought border wars, but under the reign of Duke William of Normandy, Brittany finally came under Norman hegemony. The Bretons still had their own duke, but he often fought beside William as a kind of junior partner, very much under William's tutelage. Of course, William was famous for something else besides bringing Brittany under Norman influence. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 was hugely important to the history of Brittany because it effectively re-established political ties between the island of Britain and Brittany. William recruited many Breton soldiers to fight in his army, and there were actually hundreds of Bretons fighting alongside him at the Battle of Hastings. Many Bretons settled in Britain after Hastings, and some of them gravitated toward Wales, where the language and culture of the people was not far removed from their own, not as close as Cornish, but still similar enough to make communication fairly easy. And this sort of homecoming had important consequences for the culture of all of medieval Europe, because this is how King Arthur went mainstream. Here's how it happened. In the 1130s, a man of mixed Breton and Welsh heritage named Geoffrey of Monmouth set up shop as a cleric in Oxford. There he produced a text in Latin called The History of the Kings of Britain, and he claimed it was a translation from an old book written in the British language, which in this context presumably means Welsh. The book told the history of Britain from the earliest days down through the reign of King Arthur. It contained a mishmash of stories about various British kings, including King Lear, who supposedly lived in the 8th century BC. Of course, Lear became the basis for Shakespeare's tragedy, though in Geoffrey's version, Lear successfully deposes his ungrateful daughters and Cordelia succeeds him on the throne. Shakespeare is the one who makes it into a tragedy. The most appealing sections of Geoffrey of Monmouth's text deal with Arthur, of course, and Geoffrey clearly drew on legends that had been circulating in Wales and the other British-speaking parts of the British Isles for centuries. The funny thing about Geoffrey of Monmouth, though, is that this whole backstory about the book he was supposedly translating was made up. There was probably never a book in the British language that he was translating from. He just claimed there was, because that sounded a bit more impressive and prestigious than his real source, which was a lot of oral tradition and some stuff he invented himself. But lots and lots of people believed him, and the stories in Geoffrey of Monmouth's work became the basis for the smash literary sensation of the 12th century and beyond, Arthurian literature. The reason that this story of literary influence matters to our story here is that Geoffrey of Monmouth was part of a cultural milieu that straddled the English Channel. Stories that may have once been part of a common literary heritage for the British-speaking world were brought back and reintroduced into Brittany, especially the stories concerning King Arthur, and the Bretons adopted Arthur as their own, and the Arthur stories helped to foster a kind of Breton nationalism. This was important because while Brittany may have been on the geographic margins of France, it played an important part in the power struggles that plagued Western France in the 12th century. That is because during this period, the kings of England were also great feudal magnates in France. The English kings controlled most of the western seaboard of France, but they were perpetually at war with their supposed feudal overlords, the kings of France. So where does Brittany specifically come into the story? As I said, the idea that Arthur had been the leader of a proud people with a glorious past was very popular in Brittany, where the Bretons were chafing under the overlordship, first of the Norman dukes, and then of the English kings. In the late 12th century, the Duke of Brittany had no sons, so the heir to the duchy was his daughter Constance. She was married to Geoffrey Plantagenet, the son of King Henry II of England. The idea was that Geoffrey would eventually rule Brittany as Constance's husband. However, Geoffrey died young before he could take the ducal throne. He left a daughter, Eleanor, named after Geoffrey's famous mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. But his wife Constance, the heiress to the Duchy of Brittany, was pregnant when her husband died, and the baby turned out to be a boy. What did they name him? Arthur. By giving the young prince the name of a famous British ruler, the Bretons were making a statement. They were great in the past, and they would be great again. Unfortunately, Arthur suffered a melancholy fate. He got entangled in the very complicated politics surrounding the succession to the English throne. And here is where I get to sneak in a mention of Richard the Lionheart, even though nobody would argue that he was a Celt. So, many people know that Richard was famous for going on crusade, and he was fairly successful in achieving some carefully circumscribed goals in the East. But he didn't manage to capture Jerusalem. On his return to Europe, he was captured himself by the vassal of one of his most powerful enemies, and England had to pay a huge ransom for him to be released. The rest of his reign was spent cleaning up the damage that was done to his authority in all of his domains, both English and French, by his long absence, first on crusade, then in captivity. It was in one such cleanup exercise in 1199 that Richard received a fatal arrow wound. He left several possible heirs. One was his only surviving legitimate brother, Prince John, who was widely loathed. Among other adventures, he had conspired with the great enemy of England, King Philip Augustus of France, to keep Richard from being released from captivity. The other possible heir was John's nephew, the 12-year-old Prince Arthur, who was the son of John's deceased older brother Geoffrey. But we have here a classic case of uncle pitted against nephew. King Philip of France decided to exploit this succession struggle, and he backed Prince Arthur. It was better for France to have a young and inexperienced King of England, instead of a full-grown man, even one as unpopular as John. Over the next couple of years, John and Arthur fought for the succession, and finally, in 1202, John captured Arthur, and the boy was never seen again. Rumors circulated about his fate. John almost certainly had him killed, although there were some reports that John had actually done the evil deed himself. But the joke was on John, because this probable murder of Arthur, among other factors, helped to turn public opinion against him, and within a few years he had lost most of his lands in France to the French king. And Brittany re-established its autonomy within France. It was essentially independent. And the Bretons clung fiercely to their independence, even in the face of the machinations of two very powerful potential overlords, England and France, and they managed to hold off political subordination all the way until the late 15th century, when the ducal line failed in the male line, and Anne, Duchess of Brittany, married two French kings in succession. And this union finally cemented the incorporation of Brittany within the French kingdom. Although Breton political autonomy was officially at an end, Breton the language survived, and until fairly recently, it was the most widely spoken of the Celtic languages. Even in the 1980s, there were possibly 1 million speakers of Breton. That number has since declined precipitously to about 500,000 speakers, and Breton is now outstripped by Welsh in the number of active speakers of the language. Still, the survival of Breton is a powerful testament to the strength of Breton identity, because it occurred in the face of strong official opposition from the central French government. Supposedly, there were signs on school walls in Brittany that read, Il est interdit de parler breton et de cracher par terre, which means, it is forbidden to speak Breton and to spit on the floor. It turns out that no such actual signs have ever been found, so this is probably a myth propagated by language activists who see an advantage in exaggerating the opposition they have had to face in preserving the Breton language. Today, many aspects of traditional Breton culture still flourish, including music, of course, which I will talk about much more in a later lecture. But for now, I'll just mention a few famous Bretons. The medieval cleric Peter Abelard, the ill-fated husband of Heloise, was from Brittany. He spent some time in exile at a monastery in the far reaches of Brittany, where he was apparently so unpopular with his monks that they tried to poison him. Other famous Bretons include the explorer Jacques Cartier, who claimed Canada for France, and the science fiction writer Jules Verne. Let's move on now to the other region I want to talk about in this lecture. The story of Galicia is in some respects similar to the story of Brittany, but there are also key differences between the two cases. One very important point to start with is that Galicia has had one of the most varied experiences of any of the Celtic-speaking regions. Galicia has an unimpeachable Celtic pedigree, but unlike Brittany, it preserves very little of the Celtic language that was originally spoken there. The region is named for the Galaiki, the Celtic-speaking people who lived in northwestern Iberia in the first millennium BC. They were conquered by the Romans during the reign of Augustus, around the turn of the millennia, and they were ruled by Rome thereafter until 410 AD, when the Germanic tribe known as the Suebi settled in the region. The Suebi, in their turn, were conquered by another Germanic people, the Visigoths, who established hegemony over most of Spain in the 6th century. And here we come to one of the key similarities between Galicia and Brittany. Like Brittany, Galicia also received an infusion of Celtic speakers from Britain in the 5th century, at just the time that other groups of people from western Britain were settling in Brittany. These British incomers were so numerous, in fact, that in 569, at the Church Council of Lugo, they were assigned their own bishop. But there was a key difference between Galicia and Brittany. Unlike in Brittany, where the newcomers provided a kind of Celtic transfusion, in Galicia, the newcomers did not lead to the establishment and preservation of a Celtic language as the local vernacular. And this is because by the period of the British migrations, the Celtic character of Iberia was already severely attenuated. The Iberian Peninsula was more thoroughly Romanized than Gaul. Moreover, as we saw in an earlier lecture, Spain had not been entirely Celtic-speaking at the time of the Roman conquest. There were groups of non-Celtic Iberian speakers intermingled with the areas of Celtic speech, and this linguistic diversity probably hastened the transition in Roman-ruled Iberia to the Latin language, which of course later gave us Spanish and Portuguese and the other modern vernaculars of the Iberian Peninsula. By the 5th century, the Celtic languages that had been spoken in Spain had declined precipitously. Thus, when the British speakers I spoke about a moment ago arrived in Galicia, there was less of a Celtic language base on which to build, and their influence ultimately dissipated. The local language spoken in Galicia today is on the dialect continuum between Spanish and Portuguese, actually closer to Portuguese than to Spanish. It is certainly not Celtic, and while there are some words of Celtic origin in Galician, comparatively few of them are really directly derived from the local Celtic language. Many of them came into Spanish from elsewhere in the Roman world. Thus, in Galicia, it is much harder to trace Celtic continuity through language. And in fact, if one were to apply a strict definition of Celtic identity related to language, Galicia would have to be classified as post-Celtic. Unlike an area like Cornwall, where the language had died out but was well attested, we just don't have very much of the Galician Celtic language that survives in written form, just a few stone inscriptions. There is just not enough left to revive. We'll talk in a later lecture about if and how a region can claim to be Celtic if it has lost its Celtic language so completely. But one of the most intriguing aspects of Galicia for Celtic enthusiasts comes from the intriguing hints of a connection between Spain and Ireland that I talked about in an earlier lecture. We have seen that the main text about Irish origins, the Book of Invasions, claims that the inhabitants of Ireland came from Spain. Is there any chance that these stories preserve a memory of an actual connection between Spain and Ireland? Well, as I said before, it's not terribly likely that these particular stories are true. There was probably not a literal invasion of Ireland by the Sons of Meal. But, as I also mentioned, the theory that the Celtic languages may have arisen on the Atlantic coast of Europe does present some interesting possibilities. From the few linguistic clues that survive about the Galician Celtic language, it seems to have been a Q-Celtic version of Celtic. Irish is also Q-Celtic, whereas the Celtic languages of Britain are P-Celtic, and Gaulish was probably P-Celtic as well. This would tend to suggest that Celtic made it to Ireland from Spain. So if not the Sons of Meal, perhaps some anonymous traders deep in the remote past brought Celtic to Ireland from Galicia. So, as I said, these stories might be true by accident. There is one other intriguing aspect of the Irish-Spanish connection. We have no evidence that the story of a Spanish origin for the Irish was known in Spain in the early Middle Ages, but it did become widely known many centuries later. And now, the Spanish are very conscious of the existence of this story, and they are not about to let the opportunity go to waste, because this is big tourist business. For example, there is a monument on the Galician coast in A Coruña that has been interpreted as the Tower of Brogan. It's actually a Roman lighthouse. Brogan is another name for Meal, the father of the first Gaelic settlers in Ireland. And just to hammer this connection home, a modern statue of Brogan has been placed at the start of the pathway to the tower, greeting visitors as they approach from the parking lot. Brogan is a character in the Book of Invasions who supposedly built a tower from which his sons were able to spot the island of Ireland. The modern Galician anthem called The Pines refers explicitly to the story of Brogan. Now, the anthem was written in 1907, at the height of the period we may call the Celtic Revival. It does not represent any kind of authentic connection between the Galician past and Ireland, but it does stake a claim for Celticness. Galicia is now in the midst of a full-blown Celtic revival. The tower is surrounded by a sculpture garden full of artworks referencing the Celtic past. Tour guides at the tower wear kilts that have no relevance to authentic Galician traditions of dress, the better to cement the Celtic connection in the minds of tourists. Now, even if this specific aspect of the Celtic connection between Galicia and Ireland is a bit over the top, there is another aspect of Celtic heritage in Galicia that is much more securely anchored. Galician music has many affinities with music in other parts of the Celtic fringe. In fact, if you listen to Galician music, you can certainly hear the similarities to music from other parts of the Celtic world, and we'll talk more about this music in a later lecture. So even if Galicians don't have a viable Celtic language, they do have music that sounds Celtic, and they may just be able to claim that they helped to turn Ireland Celtic several thousand years ago. Galicia is certainly making every effort to get into the Celtic club. It may be on the fringe of the fringe, but together with Brittany, its Celtic status seems to have been widely accepted by both scholars and, more lucratively, tourists. In this, we'll look at a different kind of external influence on the Celtic-speaking areas. We'll focus on the way Christianity was brought to the Celtic lands, particularly Ireland, and we'll try to answer the question of what, if anything, was Celtic about Christianity in the Celtic world. Our view of Celtic Christianity has changed a lot in the past few years. It used to be thought that the Celts had a very distinctive approach to religion that carried over into their practice of Christianity. In other words, that a fair bit of Celtic paganism was preserved in Celtic Christianity. And it also used to be thought that there was a major fault line in the Celtic Church between those who favored this Celtic-flavored Christianity and those who wanted to stay more in line with the Christian Church elsewhere in Europe. Scholars are far less sure about this now than they used to be. This is a vast topic, so I want to concentrate on a few key points. First, I'll talk about how Christianity came to the Celtic-speaking lands, especially Ireland. Then I will talk about two important controversies in the study of Celtic Christianity. One, the degree to which Irish Christianity incorporated elements of pre-existing Celtic beliefs into the practice of the new faith, and two, whether there really was a culture clash between Celtic Christianity and Roman Christianity. Let's begin with a very quick overview of how Christianity came to the various Celtic lands. The first of the Celtic areas to be Christianized that we know of was Roman Britain. We have evidence for Christianity in Roman Britain from as early as the 3rd century AD, possibly slightly earlier. It's certainly possible that Christianity reached Brittany and Galicia around the same time, but we just can't be sure. Since Britain was very tightly connected to Gaul at the time, the presumption is that missionaries from Gaul brought the Christian faith to Britain, where it first took root in the urban areas and then spread out into the countryside. Some Roman villas have been found in the south with clearly Christian themes in their mosaic decorations. So Christianity certainly made significant inroads. We have evidence for dozens of Christian churches having once existed during the period of Roman rule. There was a spectacular find in 1975 at Water Newton in Cambridgeshire. Objects that may have come from a local church, including a large silver cup that may have been a liturgical vessel, and a silver votive plaque containing the Christian Chi-Rho symbol. From the main areas of Roman control in Britain in the southeast, Christianity spread to the north and west, and most likely from there to Ireland. probably as early as the late 4th century. In the case of Ireland, though, the first people to bring Christianity may have been not missionaries, but Christian slaves brought to Ireland against their will. This was a period when some Irish dynasties, particularly in the south and east of Ireland, were establishing branches in western Britain, and they may well have come into contact with Christians there and brought the faith back. However it spread, there were enough Christians in Ireland that in 431, Pope Celestine sent a bishop named Palladius from Gaul to Ireland to minister to the Irish believing in Christ. So the Christian community by this point must have numbered in the hundreds at least, and it must have been vocal enough to be heard all the way in Rome. Palladius duly went to Ireland, and he seems to have had several disciples as well, and all of them founded churches, mostly in the southeast. We know very little about their work, unfortunately, because no written sources about their mission survive. That is emphatically not the case for another very important traveler to Ireland, St. Patrick. St. Patrick was a Romano-British youth who was captured by Irish raiders and brought to Ireland, where he served his master for 6 years, tending sheep, probably in the northern part of Ireland. While he was alone with the sheep, he received a divine call to escape from captivity, become a priest, and return to convert the Irish. And that is what he did. St. Patrick had many adventures along the way, some of which are still hard for scholars to understand. He managed to get taken on board a ship owned by some dubious merchants, and they sailed somewhere that might have been Gaul. But he ultimately made it back to Britain, where he then studied for the priesthood, and took it upon himself to return to Ireland to preach the gospel. We know all of this because of 2 texts that he wrote, one of which I've already discussed in detail in an earlier lecture, namely his letter to Coroticus, the British or Pictish slave trader who had stolen some of St. Patrick's newly baptized converts. But it is the other text, St. Patrick's Confessions, that tells us more in general terms about what his mission was actually like. Let me just take care of 2 well-known stories about St. Patrick right at the start. He did not drive the snakes out of Ireland. That story was not recorded until the 12th century, 700 years after he died, and it's too good not to use if it really had existed at the time. He also did not use the shamrock to teach the Irish about the Holy Trinity. That story is not recorded until the 18th century, but it rapidly became so popular that the shamrock is now one of the most well-recognized symbols of Ireland. But back to the Confessions. Because Ireland was a very decentralized place with many small independent kingdoms, St. Patrick describes going around preaching to all of these kingdoms individually. It was much easier to convert larger political entities such as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms later on, where if you got the king to accept the new faith, he would bring the nobility with him and they would bring their followers and so on. In Ireland, this process took many small acts of evangelism rather than a few large ones. St. Patrick also had to battle against some important social and cultural presuppositions in Irish society. The 2 that he talks about most have to do with warfare and marriage. St. Patrick evidently preached a fairly pacifist brand of Christianity, and this emphasis on peace was a tough sell in Ireland where fighting was endemic, and in fact probably necessary since there was no developed state to protect people from their enemies. It was easy to refrain from bloodshed personally if you were within the Roman Empire and you had the legions to fight for you, but that was not the case in Ireland. The other problem St. Patrick had in preaching Christianity had to do with marriage. The Christian church in its early centuries was profoundly ambivalent towards marriage. At best, it regarded marriage as a lesser option after virginity. St. Patrick apparently preached the value of virginity to his converts, and the idea did not go over well with their parents. Irish society was based on kinship, And in this system, marriages were very important for establishing relationships with potential political and military allies, and of course for producing offspring. St. Patrick's converts apparently faced tremendous parental pressure to renounce their new faith due to this issue of marriage. But of course, many of St. Patrick's new Christians did marry, and his work bore fruit, along with that of probably other missionaries whose names we don't know. At some point in the early 5th century, other missionaries brought the monastic movement to Ireland, possibly from both southwestern Scotland and from Wales. Monasteries became very important centers of learning in Ireland, and in fact, the church in Ireland ended up having more monasteries proportionately than Britain did. The decentralized nature of monastic churches fit very well with the Irish political landscape, where territorial bishops did not take firm root until many centuries later. Christianity in Ireland was thus solidly grounded, thoroughly integrated into the life of the country, but not organized along the kinds of hierarchical lines that would be more typical on the European mainland. Let's talk now about one of the most famous monastic figures in early Irish history, St. Bridget. Bridget is important because she really allows us to confront the question of how distinctive Celtic Christianity really is. There has been tremendous scholarly controversy over the last few decades about St. Bridget. Let me tell you first a few things about her life, as we know it from the earliest hagiographical texts, and I think it might be apparent quickly what is so controversial about her. We have 3 biographies of Bridget that survive from the 7th and 8th centuries, of which 2 are in Latin and 1 is in Old Irish. This would seem like a lot of information to go on if we didn't know that Bridget was born at some point in the 5th century AD, about 2 centuries before the earliest written texts about Bridget. So here's the outline of Bridget's biography. She was born in around 451 AD as the daughter of a chieftain from Leinster in Eastern Ireland, and a Christian slave who may have been a Pictish captive converted by St. Patrick. She was famously generous from early childhood. When she gave away all her mother's butter, it was miraculously regenerated so that she would not get in trouble. But she kept giving stuff away, and this annoyed her father so much that he took her to the king of Leinster to sell her into slavery. But while the father and the king were talking, Bridget gave away the king's jeweled sword to help feed the family of a beggar. The king was impressed and persuaded Bridget's father to grant her her freedom, and she traveled around Ireland healing the sick and making peace. She eventually established a monastic house at Kildare, which means the Church of the Oak Tree. So far, so good. So here's the issue. The earliest of the 3 lives of Bridget makes her look like a pretty standard, if powerful, Christian saint. But the next 2 lives include a lot of stuff that makes her look a little bit, well, pre-Christian. In these texts, Bridget can control the waters of Ireland's rivers. And this is not the limit of her capacity to control the elements. As one scholar of St. Bridget puts it, dark and impenetrable woods gave up easy paths to those under her protection, while thieves lost their way in broad daylight. So Bridget is starting to look a little bit more like a nature goddess than a Christian saint. And these texts have led some scholars to theorize that Bridget was not a real person at all, but a goddess figure who has been recast as a Christian saint. But scholars are divided on which way the influence goes. Was Bridget a goddess who took on the attributes of a saint? That is, was there never a real person called St. Bridget, just stories about the goddess that have been repurposed to look slightly more Christian? Scholars who believe this theory point to the fact that there is a Celtic nature goddess named Breek, whose name has been found in many parts of the Celtic-speaking world, for example in the British tribal name Brigantes, and indeed in the name Britain, and the Austrian city named Bregenz. But there are actually few, if any, traces of her being venerated in Ireland itself. So could it be the other way around? Was St. Bridget a real person whose biographers made her look more like the goddess that the still semi-pagan Irish would have been familiar with, in order to make the real human person seem more impressive? I am more persuaded by the second argument, that St. Bridget was real, and that the people who wrote about her progressively made her look more and more like a goddess for literary effect. But we will probably never know for sure. The main point to take away from the story of St. Bridget, I think, is the fact that early Irish Christianity had more than a small share of pagan elements blended into it. But, as is always the case, it is important not to overstate the difference between Christianity in the Celtic lands and Christianity elsewhere. In Anglo-Saxon England in the 10th century, it was common for otherwise completely Orthodox Christians to use special charms against having their cattle shot by elves. So Celtic Christianity is not out of the mainstream in terms of the survival of paganism. The most important aspect of St. Bridget's career was certainly her work as a monastic leader. What was monasticism in Ireland like? Well, it was very ascetic. That is, it emphasized the mortification of the flesh to purge the monk of worldly desires. Monks ate very sparse diets, and most monks initially lived in very simple huts made of perishable materials that no longer survive. But slightly later, they began building in stone. Among the most famous monastic dwellings in Ireland are the distinctive beehive huts that we find in the southwest, such as the Gallerus Oratory in County Kerry. There was also a great stress on pilgrimage, on the willing sacrifice of the comforts of home and family in order to get closer to God. One of the other purposes of pilgrimage, as the Irish practiced it, was not just to deprive you of comfort, but to demonstrate your willingness to subordinate your will to God's will. You would not, in some cases, even plan where you were going, but would leave your destination and ultimate fate up to God. And this was seen as a way to achieve the same spiritual benefits as the martyrs, who also trusted wholly in God. There were three kinds of martyrdom for the early Irish. Red martyrdom is just what you would expect. It meant actually dying for Christ. Green martyrdom meant living an ascetic life right where you were. Finally, there was the white martyrdom of perpetual exile. There were three main areas where Irish monastic pilgrims went. They might go as far as continental Europe. They might also go to other locations closer to home, such as the various parts of the British Isles. Or they might simply abandon themselves to the open sea. More about that in a moment. Irish monks did not just travel abroad as individuals, they also established networks of monasteries that flourished for centuries. The two most important figures in this movement were named Saint Columba and Saint Columbanus. I always tell my students not to blame me that their names are so similar, we just have to deal with it. Let's take them in turn, starting with Saint Columbanus, who was born in about 543 AD and died in 615. Saint Columbanus set out for Gaul with 12 followers. The number was not an accident. He is often depicted with a bear, because at one point he came across a cave where he wanted to settle, but there was already a bear living there. So Columbanus actually persuaded the bear to make way for him. I'm not sure how he did this, but it's a pretty impressive feat. Besides his skills as a bear whisperer, Columbanus was genuinely holy and ascetic, but he was also a difficult man because he insisted on speaking truth to power. In this case, the king of the Franks, who had taken over Gaul by this point, and for whom France is named. Saint Columbanus criticized King Tudebert II for his lax sexual morals. Not very tactful. The real deal-breaker, though, was that Columbanus followed a different method for calculating the date of Easter. I'll have more to say about the Easter controversy in a moment, but for now it's enough to know that the Frankish clerics would not tolerate this difference of opinion, so he was exiled from the Frankish court. And this proved to be a good thing in the long run for European culture, because he went on to found important houses all over France and northern Italy that helped preserve the learning of antiquity. Like Columbanus, other Irish priests founded churches in Europe in what are now Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and we know that they maintained ties with Ireland for hundreds of years because some of these houses have manuscripts written in the 9th, 10th, 11th, and even 12th centuries that were clearly written in Irish handwriting, because scholars can usually tell where someone learned to write by the shape of the letters and other key aspects of the handwriting. So we know that these monasteries were still attracting Irish-born clerics many centuries after they were founded. And in fact, these Irish-oriented monasteries were referred to as Schultencloister or Scottish cloisters, with the Scottish here actually referring to the Scoti or the Irish. These houses lasted in Germany in the Protestant territories down to the Reformation, and in the Catholic territories all the way to the dissolution of the monasteries in the 18th century. So the impact of those Irish pilgrims to the continent endured for more than 1,000 years. As I said, at these monasteries, precious classical manuscripts were copied and preserved, leading to the claim that the Irish saved civilization, which formed the title of a best-selling book a while back. Of course, it's an exaggeration to say that the Irish saved civilization. Irish clerics were not the only ones who helped preserve the manuscript heritage of the classical world, but the exaggeration does contain a large grain of truth. Much closer to home, at about the same time as St. Columbanus was at work on the continent, a man with a very similar name was also founding a lot of monasteries, namely St. Columba. The best mnemonic device I have come up with to tell them apart is that Columbanus' name is longer and he went farther away from Ireland. Do the best you can with it. Anyway, Columba, or Columbkilla as he is also called, was almost contemporary with St. Columbanus. We don't know exactly when he was born, but he died in 597, which was coincidentally the year when St. Augustine of Canterbury landed in southeastern England to begin the work of converting the English. Little did he know at the time that St. Columba had already been working on converting the northern part of the island of Britain for many decades. St. Columba founded a very important confederation of monasteries all over the northern half of Ireland and southwestern Scotland, including Derry, Durrow, and Kells, but the most famous, the head of the confederation so to speak, was Iona, which was situated on an island in southwestern Scotland. Iona seems rather remote today, but we have to keep in mind that this was a period when sea travel was much faster and easier than travel by land. Iona ultimately provided the missionaries who converted the northern half of Britain, so it had a huge influence throughout the British Isles. About 100 years after St. Columba's death, one of his successors as abbot of Iona, a man called Ailbhnain, wrote a book about St. Columba, and it contained most of what we know about the saint. Though I would venture to say that not every word of it is literally true. I would, for instance, point out the passage that contains the first written mention of the Loch Ness Monster. Here is what supposedly happened. St. Columba was walking along the shore of Loch Ness when he came across a group of people gathered over the corpse of a man who had washed ashore after being mauled by the beast. So the saint ordered one of his followers to swim across the loch, basically to bait the monster. And of course, the beast appears and it's going for the man when suddenly the saint makes the sign of the cross, and the beast flees in terror so fast that it looks as if it is being pulled away by ropes, and the swimmer makes it safely ashore. I would like to have heard the conversation between the swimmer and the saint afterwards. Perhaps something along the lines of, "Gee boss, the next time you want to demonstrate your saintly power, could you use someone else's bait?" But the perils of water for monks were by no means confined to inland waterways. You'll remember that I mentioned 3 major destinations for Irish pilgrims. We have covered 2 of them, the European continent and the British Isles. But some pilgrims set out to sea with the deliberate aim of letting the wind take them wherever it would. Some monks must have returned to tell marvelous stories about what they had seen. The most famous such tale is, of course, the voyage of St. Brendan. St. Brendan was a monk who supposedly set out with his companions to find the Isles of the Saints. And after many adventures, including an encounter with an island that turned out to actually be a whale, and a narrow escape from an island that spewed fire, he reached his goal. Many people have read this story as a description of a transatlantic voyage to Newfoundland, and in the 1970s, the explorer Tim Severin actually reconstructed the hide-covered boat that St. Brendan would have used and demonstrated that such a voyage would have been possible. Of course, Severin had a few tools that St. Brendan lacked, such as modern navigation equipment and waterproof boots. But we can still concede that St. Brendan could have done it. But did he do it? Are such stories literally true? There are two possible reasons to suspect them. One, of course, is that they might have an allegorical Christian meaning. This is not a real sea voyage, but the voyage of the soul toward God. The other reason is that they resemble secular Irish tales about journeys to the other world across the sea. But we do know that some monks really went on such voyages, and this is definitely something that was distinctive about Christianity in Ireland. We arrive now at the second of our big questions about Celtic Christianity. What was the relationship between the Celtic churches and the Western Christian Church as a whole? The idea of Celtic distinctiveness arose because there were some genuine differences between the way Christianity was practiced in the areas of Celtic speech and in the more Roman-oriented areas of England in the south and east. But they tended to concern questions of ritual observance rather than actual belief. For example, monks marked their monastic status by cutting their hair in a special way. This was known as the tonsure, which comes from a Latin word for barbering. But the form of the tonsure was different in Ireland compared to elsewhere. Most monks would shave a round patch on the top of their heads and cut their remaining hair short all around, so you would have a fringe all around the bald spot. This is the tonsure most people today are familiar with, the Roman tonsure. In Ireland, the tonsure was quite different. Men would shave their heads from the top forward and then leave the rest of the hair long. We can actually see representations of these Irish tonsures in some of the Irish illuminated manuscripts. Now this sounds like it shouldn't be a big deal, but when you are signaling your allegiance to the monastic profession, you kind of want that signal to look the same everywhere, or at least the people who adhered to the Roman tonsure felt that way. There was another issue that was more serious because it touched on the actual liturgical practice of the church. I'm talking about the question of when to celebrate Easter. It's not a simple question because Easter is a movable feast. It's not tied to a specific date on the calendar like Christmas, which is always celebrated on December 25th, but rather to the relationship between the spring equinox and the phases of the moon. Christians changed their minds several times in the early centuries of the church about exactly how to reckon the date of Easter. In fact, these different ways of calculating the date of Easter can even help us to date the progress of conversion in Ireland. One of our earliest pieces of evidence for the date when Christianity started to make headway in Ireland is a bit of an old Easter table that reflects the method of calculating Easter from the late 4th century. So we know that Christianity probably got to Ireland before St. Patrick arrived there in the 5th century. Well, the church changed its mind twice more in the following 2 centuries, but not everybody went along with the second change. Finally, in the 7th century, all the Christian churches had adopted the second change, except for the Irish and some of the British. And increasingly, the discrepancy bothered people. Easter is, of course, the most important feast of the Christian year, and you don't want part of the church celebrating the feast while the rest of the church is still fasting for Lent. And we need to keep in mind that it was a real fast in this period. It was not just no meat on Fridays, it was no meat, eggs, or dairy products for the whole 40 days. The Irish churches of the south of Ireland got together in the year 631 and decided to conform, but most of the northern Irish churches held out. So keep in mind that this is now a split within the Irish Church. The same geographic split between north and south also held on the island of Britain, because northern England in particular was largely Christianized by Irish missionaries from Iona who used the older date of Easter. Meanwhile, in the south of England, they were using the newer date of Easter that had been introduced in Rome. Things might have carried on this way in both Ireland and Britain, but what do you do when North and South are married to each other? In the 660s, the Northumbrian king Oswy was married to a princess whose mother came from another part of England where they used the Roman Easter. Husband and wife each followed the Easter they were used to, so sometimes, when spring rolled around, it would still be Lent for the queen, so she would still be fasting, but Easter would have already arrived for the king, so he would be feasting. And that didn't work so well at court. So in 664, a meeting was held called the Synod of Whitby, at which the king got his advisors together and they decided once and for all to use the Roman Easter. This meant that England was going to orient itself much more towards the continent than towards Ireland, so Irish influence in England diminished. The Synod brought most of the so-called Celtic churches within the Roman orbit, but some aspects of church practice remained distinctive for many centuries thereafter. Now, scholars have recently cast some doubt on the traditional story of the Synod of Whitby. Almost everything we know about the Synod comes from a book written by a Northumbrian monk, that is, an English-speaking monk, named the Venerable Bede. In the 720s and 30s, Bede wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people, and we can confidently state that Bede was biased towards the English. Bede was interested in demonstrating that God had been at work in a special way among the English, and he was also very strongly pro-Roman in his church politics. That is, he wanted to emphasize the importance of the Roman mission to England in Christianizing the English, as opposed to the role of the Irish for the British. So he tended to create a very stark dichotomy between Roman Christianity on the one hand and the Christianity of the Irish and British on the other. But it's easy to exaggerate these differences. They irritated people at the time, sure, but probably not as much as we might think. We should keep in mind that the Christian churches in the centuries just before the Synod of Whitby had been convulsed multiple times by serious, even fundamental disagreements on core aspects of Christian doctrine, such as the relationship between the Father and the Son within the Holy Trinity, or the nature of Christ. None of the issues that were supposedly debated at Whitby are anything like as serious as these other theological questions. That doesn't mean they were not serious distractions at the time, but we should resist the idea that in and of themselves they represent some kind of distinctive Celtic Christianity. So how Celtic is Celtic Christianity? The picture is rather mixed. On the side of distinctiveness, we have these pagan literary touches in the lives of St. Bridget. We have the special emphasis on particular forms of pilgrimage. But on balance, the most important thing to note, I think, is how the conversion of the Celtic-speaking areas to Christianity tended to tie them to the rest of Europe, rather than reinforcing their differentness. The Christian church was a powerful uniting force that existed in what I would call a fruitful tension with local Celtic traditions. Thank you for walking these ancient paths with us tonight. If you're still awake, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video so we can keep creating quiet stories for curious minds. Rest well, and remember there's always more. History waiting just beyond the horizon. This has been the Sleepless Historian. Good night.